Welcome, I'm Asuma Kataoka and you are watching NewsX World. Kyiv claims to have struck more than 40 Russian warplanes in a massive drone offensive. The security service of Ukraine says it carried out a large-scale special operation targeting bomber aircraft across multiple airfields. At least 31 people are killed and over 115 injured in an Israeli attack near aid center run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Palestinian media reports the GHF, backed by Israel, has faced criticism over its screening methods and claims of bias. China has accused the United States of using the Shangri-La dialogue to provoke conflict and pursue its own interests, following U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's remarks labeling China as a threat in the Indo-Pacific. China's defense ministry strongly opposed the statements, calling the U.S. the biggest threat. At the Shangri-La dialogue, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth urged Europe to prioritize its own security, sparking pushback from European nations seeking balance in Asia. Meanwhile, India and Pakistani military delegates attend but completely avoid each other. Lebanon's health ministry said an Israeli strike on the south of the country on Sunday killed one person, marking the third deadly raid in 4 days despite a ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah. Bangladesh's top court reinstates the country's largest Islamist party, allowing it to contest elections over a decade. In the same day, a trial begins in absentia for ex-Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina on crimes against humanity charges. Torrential monsoon rains trigger flash floods and landslides in Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, India, leaving at least 30 people dead. Officials warn of more rain as water-soaked hillsides continue to collapse into valleys below. Festivities after PSG's Champions League win erupt into riots across Paris, leaving 2 people dead and over 550 arrested. Flares, fires, and clashes engulfed the champs' Élysées and Parc des Princes as police deployed tear gas and water cannons to contain chaos. Tensions are escalating between Russia and Ukraine after Kyiv claims to have struck more than 40 Russian warplanes in a massive drone offensive. The security service of Ukraine says it carried out a large-scale special operation targeting bomber aircraft across multiple airfields. Dramatic footage purports to show drones striking Belaya Air Base in Irkutsk, a strategic site thousands of miles inside Siberia. Russia's Air Defense Ministry has not yet responded publicly to the claims. The drone strikes represent one of Ukraine's most far-reaching military actions yet, further raising stakes ahead of possible peace talks in Istanbul. Meanwhile, a Russian delegation heads to Turkey for direct talks with Ukraine. President Zelensky has indicated Kyiv will attend the meeting in Istanbul on Monday, but as diplomacy begins, drones continue to fly. Russia says enemy UAVs hit its Murmansk and Irkutsk regions, including the first reported strike on a military unit in Siberia. Meanwhile, a Ukrainian security official says Kyiv's SBU conducted strikes on Russian strategic bombers, though no responsibility has been formally claimed. The talks come amid escalating pressure on both sides to lower the temperature. Now we have Gilbert Doktorov. He's a Russian affairs expert, joining us live from Brussels, Belgium. Thank you for joining us today. What details are available about the recent drone strikes targeting Russian military air bases deep inside Siberia?
The Russians have not commented on this, so my usual sources of information are not yet saying a word. What is surprising, of course, is the distance. We're speaking about several thousand kilometers away from Ukraine. How they could have done this is difficult to understand. Though it is, we may assume that these drones were launched from within Russia. That is to say, that the Ukrainians had secretly brought them into Russian territory and fired them from within Russia. But that's a speculation. What is important, of course, is to note the use of drones. There's been so much discussion, in international discussion, about the value to Ukraine of high technology Western missiles, particularly in recent days, the discussion of whether Germany will supply the 500-kilometer range Taurus missile to Ukraine. Well, 500 kilometers does not take you to Irkutsk. It doesn't take you much farther than the Crimea Bridge. So my point is that this is a fabricated issue, that the Ukrainians need Western missiles to attack Russian military assets. And the reality is that they have drones, which are probably Western supplied, and which probably are hitting their targets with the help of Western satellite reconnaissance information for flight paths, but not necessarily. And they are far more effective than the missiles that are being discussed today, which could unleash World War III if the Germans do provide them. That is the main lesson I see from what happened today. At the same time, this news that you've mentioned has overwhelmed the pre-existing news of the day, which has been the Ukrainian attacks on two railway lines within the Russian Federation, just across the border from Ukraine. That is, in Bryansk in particular. Bryansk is a province, a region of the Russian Federation, just to the north of Kursk, where they staged their invasion in August of 24, and which they had just been liberated a month or so ago by the Russians. So Bryansk is just to the north, to the west of Kursk. It borders on Belarus in the north and on Ukraine in the west. There was an explosion on an automobile bridge, which overflew a railway bridge, or railway line. The automobile bridge was blown up. Its debris fell on the train below and caused very serious harm. 71 people were seriously injured. Of them, 40 are in hospital, and 7 died.
Yes.
That was one attack. A separate attack. These were hours apart in the night over this weekend. And the second attack was in fact in Kursk, where it was precisely a railway line which was struck and train derailed. We don't have figures for casualties there. The Russians stated that this was a terror attack. The Ukrainians denied this, saying that this was slander and that we Ukrainians never do engage in terrorism. This is just a reason for the Russians to pull out of the negotiations for peace. Of course, the Ukrainians, who never engage in terrorism, blew up 2 Russian generals in Moscow in the last 6 to 8 months, and they financed and coordinated a terror attack by some Central Asian hirelings in a major entertainment center in the suburb of Moscow, which caused a number of deaths and enormous outrage. That was the Crocus Center. So the Ukrainians, led by Mr. Budanov, who is the responsible official for all of these terror attacks, have used terror which terror is defined as attacks on civilians for the sake of creating chaos and panic. That is precisely what the Ukrainians have been doing, and it is quite hypocritical, but not to say outrageously lying, to deny that they were involved in these attacks in the neighboring regions of Kursk and Bryansk.
And we only have a minute left here, but how might recent military and sabotage these activities influence the prospects for peace between Ukraine and Russia?
Oh, they'll have no influence whatsoever. What the Ukrainians are hoping for will be a massive strike, an unreasonable attack by Russia, a revenge attack, which they then can hold up to the West and say, look what barbarians the Russians are, etc., etc. So this is provocative, it's intentionally provocative, hoping for a Russian overreaction. There won't be any overreaction. There will probably be some more deadly Russian strikes on military assets in Ukraine. And the negotiations will likely take place tomorrow. But I do not put much trust in these talks resulting in a peace treaty or in a truce, because the parties are so far apart in their objectives and what they expect the end game to look like. So the war will go on. The real question is, when will the United States impose new harsh sanctions on Russia with one hand and deny Ukraine further aid, military, financial, and intelligence, which would be to say, when will the United States leave the war and impose these two types of punishments on the warring parties, saying that will help bring them to more moderation and peace.
Thank you. Thank you, Gilbert Doctorow, for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on to our next story. Iran has issued a warning of retaliation following a new UN nuclear report that has deepened tensions with Europe. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that Iran now possesses over 9,200 kilograms of enriched uranium, more than 45 times the limit set in the 2015 nuclear deal. This uranium is enriched to 60%, close to weapons-grade levels. Iran maintains that its nuclear program is peaceful, but Britain, France, and Germany have warned that sanctions could be reimposed if security is jeopardized. Iran's foreign minister urged the IAEA to prevent political abuse of the report, which Tehran has rejected. Iran says it will respond to any inappropriate actions from Europe. The standoff highlights escalating pressure over Iran's nuclear ambitions. Meanwhile, the US has sent a new nuclear deal proposal to Iran, confirmed to have been delivered through Omani diplomats. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said President Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff submitted a detailed and acceptable offer. Iran states it will respond based on national interests and the rights of its people. The offer comes ahead of a planned sixth round of talks, though no date or location has been set. Now we have guests joining us live. Shruti Das Gupta, she's a geopolitical expert. Thank you, Shruti, for joining us today. Is Iran's nuclear threat more political posturing or real, or is it a real military escalation?
Greetings, Asuma, and thank you for having me on your show. Iran is, of course, stockpiling. It has two mines which provide uranium to it. And from what the report states, that's 400 kgs, which is, as you said, about 40% of what it should be having. And the 60% enrichment of it ensures that if Iran decides to wreak havoc on the world, it will just take about 2 weeks to completely enrich it and empower 10 nuclear warheads. So Iran, if the report stands true, then Iran is in a position of power which is going to bother the USA, because Iran is the last proxy of Russia in the Middle East. The previous proxy was Syria, which was taken off by the regime change that happened, and now they've placed Al-Qaeda terrorist Al-Shara, formerly known as Al-Jolani, and Lashkar-e-Toiba terrorist in power over there. So they have cut off the lines there. And through Syria, they have ensured that the Hezbollah-Lebanon coalition also collapses, and hence US managed to reach a kind of peace pact with that section. They are no longer firing at each other, the US Marine as well as the Hezbollah from Lebanon, right? So they've kind of closed that chapter down. And this is all happening towards Israel as the center focus of this entire conflict. Israel is very aggressively posturing, if I understand correctly, towards Iran, and Iran is the last proxy of Russia. So if Iran is positioned in a way where it is under sanctions and has to bow down to whatever the US demands, which it did not a couple of weeks ago, the nuclear talks had come to no conclusive end, and the US had walked out. So this energy report could be a way of arm twisting Tehran into signing what the US wants it to sign. So I do not know how true this is, because I know US uses these reports very non-transparently. If you remember, during the Iraq war, there were talks of weapons of mass destruction, biological warfare weapons, and it never came to fore. There were no such weapons found once Iraq was conquered. So sending out reports when you are failing at dealing with a nation on one-on-one basis is a tactic that US often uses, and I'm not really sure of how accurate this entire report is going to be. Though Iran is very correct in its posturing and telling that this report should not be used politically against it, because the veracity of it cannot be verified until unless somebody actually walks into Tehran and does that. And Iran's not going to permit anybody inside its zone, specifically of this coterie, which is headed by the US.
And Shruti, building on that, what are the implications of a country holding uranium stockpiles far above previously agreed limits?
Well, the point entire comes back to what this report, how accurate this report is, whether you trust the agency that is generating it. And what is the reason why suddenly, when Iran and US talks on nuclear points break down, and a couple of days ago, Pakistan, as a proxy of China, went ahead, and Shehbaz Sharif was speaking in Iran, and he was telling them that as long as it's for peaceful use, they are okay with Iran stockpiling nuclear enriched uranium. So this entire narrative turns into a very different twist, basically saying that the China-Russia coalition is helping Iran to stay viable in a very hostile environment surrounded by puppet governments that have been installed by US. So as a result, this entire energy report has a lot of gray zones, because we do not understand who has released it, how they have measured it, and how true is it. For all you know, tomorrow, if it turns into an all-out war and they find that there was no enriched uranium, especially at the levels that have been reported, you'll find that another nation has been brought to its knees just because it did not agree to what the US and the other E3 countries, as in Germany, France, and UK, have find acceptable. So understanding whether it is actually at that level or not is very important right now.
Thank you very much, Shruti Dasgupta, for sharing that insight. Now we move on to our next story. A diplomatic spat has erupted between India and Pakistan over the Indus Waters Treaty, after Pakistan Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif accused New Delhi of endangering regional stability by suspending the agreement. In a sharp rebuttal at a UN conference in Dushanbe, India said Pakistan was misusing the platform for political messaging and reminded Islamabad of its own violations. India's Minister of State for Environment, Kirti Vardhan Singh, told delegates at the UN conference on glaciers that Pakistan's remarks were completely unrelated to the forum's purpose. He said New Delhi strongly objected to what it saw as an attempt to politicize a technical and environmental platform. He also pointed out that since the treaty was signed in 1960, global conditions have significantly changed, ranging from climate change and population growth to repeated acts of cross-border terrorism. According to Singh, these developments call for a fresh look at the treaty and its obligations. India, which suspended the treaty on April 23rd, just a day after the deadly terror attack in Pahalgam that killed 26 civilians, said the decision was a non-military step made in response to repeated violations by Pakistan. Prior to India's remarks, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had criticized New Delhi's move, calling it one-sided and warning that it posed serious risks to millions of people. He accused India of politicizing water sharing for narrow domestic gains. India, for its part, maintained that the treaty was rooted in trust. It argued that Pakistan's continued support for terrorism undermines that very foundation, making the proper implementation of the treaty increasingly difficult. The Indus Waters Treaty, brokered by the World Bank in 1960, governs the sharing of the Indus River system between the two countries. Despite decades of hostilities, it has often been cited as a rare example of sustained cooperation between India and Pakistan. Now we have guests joining us. Shruti Das Gupta, she's a geopolitical expert. Thank you for staying with us, Shruti. How should India interrupt or interpret Pakistan's comments on the Indus Waters Treaty at an international forum?
Pakistan loves to go crying to its big daddies, which stay in UN. So this is something that is where India knows very often. It has violated its ceasefires numerous times since it was signed in 2013, and yet it still goes to the UN and cries wolf. And this time, when we have taken a non-kinetic action of putting the Indus Water Treaty in abeyance, it is now citing that it's a major impact on their agriculture and livelihoods of its people. But you have to understand, even before the abeyance of Indus Water Treaty, Pakistan's poor water management systems ensured that at least 20% of the kharif crops were lost. So they are, as it is, a country which have not planned for the future. Now, according to Vienna Convention, Article 60, this kind of an agreement can't be put in abeyance because there is a fundamental change in circumstances. And this is exactly the clause that India has used to put it in abeyance. Now, accusing India of waging water wars is something that is stretching the truth a little bit too much. Because of the treaty itself, India was not allowed to desilt its dams. That means that there was soil and silt allowed to build up inside the dams that were already present on the 20% water supply that India was only allowed to use. So out of the 6 rivers, 3 were allowed and only about 20% of the water was allowed to be used by India. Now, India is now 1.4 billion people. It is progressing. It has its own developmental graph, which Pakistan, unfortunately, is not following for itself. So at the desilting point, when there is a lack of water and an increase in population and production, India holds the right to kind of step back from a treaty that was not for its benefit and then reevaluate it with Pakistan. Unfortunately, right now, because Pakistan is a terror state and is refusing to acknowledge the fact that its military and terrorist groups walk hand in hand, share hoardings and the same platform to deliver speeches. So India is not in a mood to sit and talk to them. They would like to go to UN, and unfortunately IMF, World Bank and the UN listen to it. But I'm very sure that now the footages that is coming out of Pakistan is showing its true face, that they're really not really concerned about their people. If they were, they wouldn't have planned the Green Project, which was to divert all the waters from the Sindh province region only to Punjab, Pakistan, to settle its army officers conclave. So Pakistan as a state ensures that only and only its army progresses. It doesn't really care about its kharif crop because it did not plan water properly and has already lost 20% of its kharif crops. So it is not about the livelihood of people. It is not about the sustenance. They are using the misery, which is a very standard playbook action by Pakistan, using the misery of its people that the administration and the military have themselves created to cry wolf at UN. And India is not taking any form of action on that kind of a dialogue.
And Shruti, Switching gears here for a moment, given challenging climate conditions and regional security concerns, is there a case for revisiting or modernizing this Indus Waters Treaty or framework?
Definitely there is. Definitely there's a section where we can go ahead and have talks. But to sit at the talking table, Pakistan has to walk out of its terror camps. It has to mend its ways. It has to acknowledge that it was growing and nurturing terrorists and was doing all of this with the solo aim of destabilizing the sovereignty of India. So once it acknowledges that, mends its ways, I am very sure that dialogues can open back between these two countries. But if Pakistan continues the same way it does, a few days ago, its now Field Marshal Asim Munir spoke about it being a red line. So they are threatening us with war on water on one hand, and then they want to sit on the talking table without really acknowledging responsibly how they should go forth.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that insight, Shruti. And now we close this. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.